America's most secure prison had a breakout. Here's how it happened. The alarm began screaming through the cold concrete halls of the prison at exactly 2:17 a.m. The red lights flashed, sirens blared, and guards sprinted in every direction shouting, "Code red! Code red! All units, lockdown!" Within minutes, the entire facility was awake. United States Penitentiary Marion, once called escape-proof, had just been proven wrong. 4 men were gone. Their cells were empty. The most secure prison in America had been breached. A guard, pale and trembling, stared at the open cell doors that should have been locked tight. The steel bars were sliced clean, almost perfectly, not broken or forced, but cut. The night camera feed showed nothing unusual. No alarms triggered. No movement detected. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. Outside, the spotlight towers scanned across the perimeter fence. Every beam passed the same way, over the same coils of razor wire, until one of them stopped. A single section of the fence sagged, its wires twisted open neatly, almost invisible from a distance. The guard in the tower leaned forward, his heart pounding. He pressed the intercom and shouted, "We've got a breach." Down below, fresh footprints led away from the fence into the darkness. The wind howled across the Illinois fields as the realization spread through the prison. Someone had done the impossible. But how? Hours earlier, just before midnight, the night seemed calm. The inmates were locked in. The guards walked their rounds, boots echoing through the halls. In cell block C, inmate Jack Dempsey sat quietly on his bunk, staring at the floor. He had been at Marion for 7 years, sentenced for armed robbery and escape attempts. The guards thought he'd given up. They were wrong. Under his mattress, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible, was a small metal rod, one piece of many. For 8 months, Dempsey and 3 others had worked together, each responsible for a part of the plan. Leo Carter, a former welder, made tools out of stolen kitchen utensils. Frank Malone, an electrician, learned the timing of the power cuts during nightly maintenance. And Eddie Brooks, the youngest of them, had memorized guard patrols down to minute. Every night, while the other inmates slept, they whispered through air vents, passing notes folded into cigarette papers. Their goal was simple: get out of Marion, the unbreakable prison. The plan began when Leo discovered something strange about the steel bars. They were old. The original construction from the 1960s had never been fully replaced, only painted. Beneath the layers of gray paint, the metal had weakened from years of humidity. With patience, they could cut through it. Each man worked a few minutes at a time during the loudest hours, when machines in the laundry or plumbing rooms masked the noise. The rods were filed piece by piece using sharpened bolts smuggled from the workshop. When a guard walked by, they'd stop, cover the marks with toothpaste and paper, and pretend to be asleep. They weren't just planning to escape. They were planning to humiliate the entire system. At exactly midnight, Dempsey nodded to the others through the vent. It was time. Frank shut off a small circuit in the hallway panel. He knew it would kill the nearby cameras for 90 seconds. Leo began cutting the last bar of his cell window, the metal nearly giving way. Eddie used the mattress springs to silence the vibrations. Sweat dripped from their faces. They'd come too far to stop now. When the final piece of steel gave way, Dempsey whispered, "We're out." The hole was just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. One by one, they slid down a narrow maintenance shaft behind the cells, an area only engineers used during inspections. It was dark, full of dust and cobwebs, but it led directly to an air duct system that stretched under the prison. As the 4 men crawled through the tunnels, their breaths echoed in the narrow metal space. The air smelled like rust and old water. Above them, guards walked their nightly rounds, unaware that the escape was already in motion. They reached the end of the duct, where a single vent cover stood between them and freedom. Leo took out a small tool made from a toothbrush and a screw. He began unscrewing the bolts one by one. Each click sounded louder than thunder in the silence. Suddenly, they froze. Footsteps echoed above. A flashlight beam swept across the vent. For a long, terrifying moment, no one moved. Then the light turned away. The footsteps faded. Leo smiled shakily. "We're clear," he whispered. The final bolt came loose. The vent dropped open, revealing a dark crawl space that led straight to the outer fence. Cold night air rushed in. They had done it. But as they stepped out, a loud snap echoed to the yard, the sound of wires snapping under tension. All four froze, staring at each other. A voice shouted from the tower, "Hey, who's there?" The searchlight turned straight toward them. The white beam cut through the darkness like a blade, catching all four men frozen in place. "Run," Dempsey hissed. They bolted toward the far end of the yard. Their feet pounded the frozen dirt as the siren blared behind them. Bullets weren't fired. Marion had strict orders against gunfire near escapees at night. But the towers lit up with floodlights, scanning wildly. "Get to the drainage pipe." Frank shouted, pointing ahead. Beyond the fence lay a narrow ditch with an old steel pipe that ran under the field. It had been part of the prison's original drainage system, sealed decades ago, but Dempsey had confirmed through an old maintenance map that it's still connected to a storm channel outside the perimeter. If they could reach it, they'd be free. They dropped to the ground, crawling through grass slick with dew as the siren screamed louder. The sound of boots and radios echoed behind them. Guards were shouting over the loudspeakers. "All units, Section C breach. Repeat, Section C breach. Lockdown in progress." Eddie's voice shook. "They're gonna catch us, man." Dempsey grabbed him by the shirt and pulled him close. "You keep running. You stop, you die here." They reached the fence. Leo took out a homemade wire cutter, a pair of pliers he'd built using a screwdriver and bits of steel smuggled from the workshop. He began cutting fast, sparks flickering in the cold air. The smell of burning metal filled their lungs. One strand, two, three, then, snap, the final wire gave way, and the men slipped through the hole. Dempsey turned to help Leo crawl out, when a voice boomed behind them. "Stop. Hands where we can see them." Two guards had appeared on the yard's edge, flashlights trained on them. Dempsey didn't think. He shoved Leo forward. "Go!" They dove into the ditch just as a spotlight swept over their backs. The guard shouted again, running toward the fence. But by then, all four men had vanished into the darkness. Inside the pipe, it was pitch black and freezing. The air was thick with the smell of rust and damp soil. Eddie gagged as cold water splashed up his legs. "Where does this go?" "East," Frank whispered. "If the map was right, we come out by the old maintenance shed." They crawled through the pipe for what felt like forever, their hands slipping on the wet metal. Rats scurried past them. The sound of the alarms grew fainter. For the first time, they dared to believe they might actually make it. When they finally reached the end, Dempsey peered to the grating. It opened into a small concrete channel just outside. The prison walls. Above them, the Illinois night stretched wide and empty. They were free. One by one, they climbed out and crouched low behind a cluster of bushes. In the distance, the prison glowed red with warning lights, helicopters circling like angry hornets. "Holy hell," Leo whispered, panting. "We did it. We actually did it." Dempsey smiled faintly. "Not yet. We still gotta disappear." They split into pairs as planned. Dempsey and Eddie headed east toward the forest, while Frank and Leo veered south, hoping to reach the old train tracks that led toward St. Louis. They promised to regroup in 48 hours at an abandoned barn 3 miles away. The cold bit their faces as they ran through the open field. Every sound made them flinch. The whir of helicopter blades, the bark of police dogs in the distance, the echo of radios. Eddie was trembling, barely keeping pace. "Jack," he gasped, "where'll they find us?" "They won't," Dempsey said flatly. "Not if we keep moving." By sunrise, they reached the edge of the forest. The trees rose tall and dark, their branches swaying in the wind. Dempsey stopped, scanning the sky. The helicopter was gone. For now, they found a narrow creek and followed it until they reached a small, half-collapsed shack. It looked abandoned, just a few broken boards and an old cot. It would have to do. Eddie slumped onto the floor, exhausted. "We can't keep running like this. I need food, I need..." Dempsey cut him off. "You need to stay quiet. They'll have every roadblock up and 20 miles by now. We move when it's dark." Eddie nodded weakly. The adrenaline had worn off, And now fear was setting in. Outside, the forest creaked in the wind. Hours passed in silence. Then, as the sun began to set, Dempsey's eyes drifted to something in the corner of the shack, a dusty box with a faded logo that read U.S. Bureau of Prisons. He walked over and knelt beside it. Inside, under a layer of old papers, were 2 folded uniforms. Not prison guard uniforms. Federal transport suits. Dempsey's stomach twisted. This place was used by them, he whispered. Eddie looked up. Used by who? Before Dempsey could answer, a voice crackled faintly from outside. A radio close. He motioned for silence. They pressed against the wall, holding their breath as footsteps crunched the leaves outside. Then, through the cracks of the wooden wall, a beam of light swept across the room. A man's voice spoke into a radio. "I've got tracks heading straight for the shack." Dempsey's eyes widened. He reached for the metal rod in his pocket, his pulse racing. Eddie whispered, terrified, "What do we do?" Dempsey stared at the door and whispered back, "We fight." The door handle began to turn. The wooden door swung open with a crash, splinters flying into the air. A flashlight beam cut across the dark shack, sweeping over the walls before stopping on Dempsey, and Eddie crouched in the corner. "Freeze!" the officer shouted, stepping inside with a pistol drawn. For 1 second, everything went silent. The wind outside, the creaking boards, even Eddie's breathing. Then Dempsey moved. He lunged forward, knocking the flashlight from the guard's hand. It clattered to the floor, spinning in circles, throwing light across the walls. Eddie grabbed a loose plank and swung it wildly, hitting the man's arm. The gun fired once, the sound exploding through the shack. The bullet tore into the ceiling, sending dust raining down. Dempsey grabbed the gun and shoved the officer to the floor. "Don't move," he yelled. The guard groaned, clutching his shoulder. His radio crackled. A voice shouting through it, "Unit 3 report. Unit 3, what's your status?" Eddie's eyes went wide. "They know he found us." "Then we're out of time," Dempsey said. He grabbed the man's radio and slammed it against the floor, shattering it. Then he pulled the man's badge from his vest. Federal Marshal, Task Force E9. E9. Dempsey froze for half a second. That was the same name stamped on the old prison blueprints. Why would the marshals have a task force named after a facility? He muttered. But there was no time to think. Sirens were already echoing faintly through the woods. They had minutes at best. Dempsey and Eddie ran out the back of the shack, heading deeper into the forest. Branches whipped against their faces, and the mud pulled at their shoes. The sun was gone now, the forest lit only by flashes of red and blue from far behind. They didn't stop until the sirens faded. When they finally slowed down, Eddie fell to his knees, gasping. "We can't keep this up," he said, his voice shaking. "They're not just prison guards anymore. This is bigger than that." Dempsey looked around the dark trees, breathing hard. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Much bigger." They kept moving east until they reached a quiet country road. There, parked under an old bridge, was a broken-down delivery truck. It looked abandoned. The tires half flat, the windshield cracked. Dempsey tried the door. It opened. Inside, they found dusty crates, a few tools, and an old paper map pinned to the dashboard. The map was marked with several red circles. One of them, drawn in thick marker, surrounded the very area they were standing in. "What is this?" Eddie whispered. Before Dempsey could answer, he noticed something else. A camera mounted inside the truck, its small red light blinking. It was recording. They'd walked straight into a trap. "Get down!" Dempsey shouted, pulling Eddie to ground just as headlights flashed on the ridge above. Black SUVs rolled silently toward them, their engines low, their lights cutting through fog. How'd they find us so fast? Eddie cried. Dempsey looked back at the badge he'd taken, Task Force E9. The same people who built the prison were the ones hunting them now. Within seconds, men in tactical gear began spreading out through the trees. Dempsey grabbed a wrench in the truck and smashed the camera lens. Then he turned to Eddie. "Run for the creek. Don't stop for anything." "What about you?" "I'll lead them away." Eddie hesitated, but Dempsey shoved him toward the trees. "Go!" As Eddie disappeared into the fog, Dempsey took off in the opposite direction, toward the hill. A searchlight hit the ground behind him, sweeping across the grass. Voices shouted, "Visual on target. Move in." Dempsey zigzagged through the trees, diving behind a fallen log as bullets cracked through the night. He crawled forward, the mud cold against his hands. Then he spotted it, a small concrete tunnel half buried near the ridge. It looked like an old sewer entrance. He slid inside and dropped into darkness. The air was thick and damp. Water dripped somewhere deep ahead. He followed the sound, using his hands to feel the walls. Every step echoed through the tunnel, mixing with the distant thuds of boots above. Then he saw something that made him stop cold. Painted on the tunnel wall, almost washed away by time, were the faded letters, E9 Access Maintenance Shaft. Dempsey's stomach turned. This wasn't just any tunnel. It was connected to the prison. He followed it deeper until he reached a locked metal door. Beside, it was an old control panel with a keypad. The screen was cracked, but still glowing faintly. A message blinked, "Authorized personnel only." He stared at it for a moment, breathing hard. Then, slowly, he entered the only number he could think of, the same one stamped on the guard's badge, 9132. The lock clicked. The door hissed open. A stale, recycled breeze blew into his face. The tunnel ahead was lit by faint, flickering bulbs. He stepped inside and froze. There, standing in the corridor ahead, was Leo Carter, the welder who had escaped with him 2 nights ago. His clothes were filthy, his face pale, but his eyes were empty. "Leo," Dempsey whispered. "How did you—" Leo turned his head slowly. "You shouldn't have come back, Jack." Before Dempsey could speak, the door behind him slammed shut, locking him inside. The lights flickered once, then went out completely. The darkness inside the tunnel was total, the kind that made it hard to know if your eyes were even open. Dempsey's pulse pounded in his ears. He reached out into the black and whispered, "Leo, what's going on here?" There was no reply, only the sound of slow, wet breathing a few feet away. Then a faint hum began, the same deep electrical vibration he'd heard inside the prison before the alarms went off. Somewhere in the dark, a red emergency light flicked on, washing the corridor in a dim glow. Leo stood completely still at the far end of the hallway, staring at nothing. His lips moved, but his words came out broken like static. They never let anyone leave. Dempsey stepped closer, his voice low and trembling. "Who's they, Leo? What happened to you?" Leo blinked, and for a moment his expression softened, as if the real Leo was fighting to come through. "They made us part of it," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You didn't escape, Jack. You were released." Before Dempsey could ask what he meant, a speaker crackled above them. The same cold, mechanical voice that had once barked orders inside Marion now echoed through the tunnel. "Containment breach in Sector 12. Subject D, 417 detected. Reacquisition in progress." The lights flashed red. Dempsey's stomach dropped. Subject D, 417. That was his prison ID number. He looked at Leo in horror. "They're tracking me." Leo smiled weakly, tears in his eyes. They never stopped. The hum grew louder until the walls themselves seemed to shake. Dempsey backed away as a heavy steel door slid open at the end of the tunnel. Behind it, a long hallway filled with flickering fluorescent lights led to rows of old rooms, offices, labs, cells, all abandoned but still humming with power. He turned to Leo, but the man was gone. Dempsey gritted his teeth and stepped into the hallway. The air smelled of oil and disinfectant, the kind of sterile stench that never left government buildings. As he moved forward, he passed a series of glass windows, each revealing things that made his blood run cold. In one room, hospital beds lined the walls with monitoring equipment still beeping faintly. In another, files were stacked in boxes labeled Behavioral Control Division and Subject Reconditioning Program. And then he saw it, a file folder sitting open on a desk. On its cover, Project Iron Gate Facility E9. He flipped it open. Inside were photos of prisoners, their faces circled, names redacted. But one photo made him freeze. It was of himself. The caption read, Subject D 417, Behavioral Analysis, Phase 3, Status, Released for Observation. Released? He whispered, reading the words again. They hadn't escaped at all. They'd been let out, watched, studied. The entire breakout had been a test. A metallic clank sounded behind him. Dempsey spun around. The door at the end of the hall was opening again. Shadows moved in the red light. Tall figures in black uniforms, faceless under glass visors. He grabbed the folder and bolted down a side corridor. The boots thundered after him. He ran past another door, this one marked Operations. Through the small window, he saw something that almost made him stop. A control room filled with monitors showing live feeds from across the country. Every screen displayed faces. People walking streets, entering buildings, sitting in cars. Each one tagged with small white numbers. One of them zoomed in on a gas station camera. Standing there, looking lost and exhausted, was Eddie Brooks. Dempsey's heart stopped. Eddie was alive. But if these cameras were showing live feeds, it meant they were still watching all of them. He turned to run again, clutching the file. But just as he reached the exit door, a bright white light exploded in front of him. The sound of the hum rose into a roar, and then silence. When Dempsey opened his eyes, he was standing in a small, white room.